this story? Why did it have to be London? And
because yeah, good question. And the reason is, I am Australian, but I did live in London for years. And when I went to London, what really struck me as an Australian, because as an Australian, you are used to new cities plonked on ancient land, and the two have nothing in common. There's no dialogue there. It's just, we're going to put that European city on that Australian land, and that's just the way it is. Whereas in London, it's such an old city. It's thousands of years old, and older, actually, if you look at the fact that there were settlements there pre-Roman times. Everything's grown into itself. And so I was really struck with the sense when you go to London of it's nestled into the ground. And it's almost like the energy of the ground is coming up into the city, and vice versa. I found it, I didn't have that sense of there's the city, there's the land. It was all one thing. And I also had a sense walking through those old streets where millions of people have walked for thousands of years. It's quite mind-boggling that there's like a character in those streets which seems to be intrinsic, and it's like, it doesn't matter how much gentrification you put on top, it doesn't matter how many pret-a-manger's or cafes or whatever you put there, and how many bankers' salaries are used to build, amazing buildings. There are some areas that just don't change. They don't change, and it's almost like this psychological profile of the place. So I was struck by that as an Australian. I hadn't come across that before. And I guess it's the same with any old city. You get that in any old city. It's just that I wasn't familiar with them. But I lived in London, and I did have this sense that it spilt over its edges, and it was character as well as place. I had a very strong sense that it was character, or characters in the case of my book, as well as place. So that's where it came from. And it actually started out as... sounds ridiculous. The original idea sounded out as rhyming couplets for my kids. And so I actually got all these rhyming couplets, and it started out with the characters. I was just playing with the characters. And then it sort of developed, and it sat in a drawer for a very long time, that idea. And then it became what it is today. It went through a journey of being a contemporary novel. And it was interesting and good, but it wasn't quite right. And then it was actually some advice I got that gave me an aha moment, and thought, actually, that belongs somewhere else. And I decided to put it into Victorian London, and it found its home. It was just perfect, because Victorian London, as I said in my pictures, was the biggest city the world had ever seen at the time. And it was just, we look back at it, and it's, we think of Dickens, it's a bit nostalgic, it's grim, it's cobwebby, it's Nell, from Little Nell, it's all these characters, it's quite familiar to us. But I think living through it at the time would have been more like Blade Runner, or it's just technology. It was dystopian, there was extremes. There was like, people say it's the worst place to be poor ever, anywhere, but also great wealth. Things were changing. Technology was crazy. It was the telegraph, which was like time travel to us now. It was that out there. So I think it was a very unsettled time, and just a time of turmoil. And so it just felt, and then obviously you've got Greenwich and the whole time thing. So it just felt that was its natural home. So yeah, sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, but very, very interesting. And like, I wouldn't have anticipated that at all, that it had started out, one, as rhyming couplets, but two, as something more contemporary, and you were kind of guided to the historical angle on it.
It's crazy now, because now I look at it and go, well, of course it belongs there. That's exactly where it was. Why don't you to realise that? So,
What was that like? Well, I wanted to ask about your research process, and maybe if you had any advice for aspiring, just YA writers who might want to couch their stories in a certain real world context and then add the sprinkling of fantasy or whatever over it. What wisdom may you impart to those people who are starting that journey?
I don't know if I'd recommend my method, which was basically just to read so much. I just went down so many rabbit holes. I have a stack of the books that I've bought, but that's without the library books and the online articles and the Kindle books and all of that. I read and I read and I read and I read, and I researched. I just read everything I could around. I mean, I found it fascinating. It was actually self-indulgent. I think I was actually avoiding getting down to writing, if I'm honest. It's a rabbit hole to go down, and it's fascinating, and it must be the most documented period of London history, Victorian London. There's just so much literature, there's so much so much happened, Darwin published, Origin of Species, and there was just all this stuff intellectually, scientifically, technologically, artistically. There's so much there. So yeah, I read and I read and I read. I spoke to people. I talked to people in the museums of there's something called the Worshipful Company of Clockmakers in London. I went to them and I talked to them about, what it was like to be a watchmaker back then. Greenwich Observatory. I was living in London at the time, so and although I did a lot of the writing when I was back here in Australia, I did actually visit those places, and I went and I walked around and I imagined what it would have been like, and I felt the ghosts and all that sort of thing. So I think my method, I'm not saying this is the best method, I'm sure there are many more efficient methods, but was total immersion and just getting my hands on everything I could possibly get my hands on. I also create Pinterest mood boards. So I just had a lot of pictures of cemeteries at one point of whatever I'm working on, just to sort of have a look at it and sort of think, yeah, that's the kind of vibe I'm after. That's the trigger for that mood or something. So yeah, and no nice neat approach really. Just it's you sort of read that and then you think, and then also you're researching as you go. So I did stop and research. I did stop because I knew as much as anybody about Victorian London, but I needed to know a lot more about kind of the weather of it, if you know what I mean. I needed to know what it was like to live in Victorian London. So I read a lot of books on that, what it was like. There's some excellent books on that, actually. What's it like just to go through the days of Victorian Londoner, and what was the reality of it, and what were their concerns, and what was going on in the rest of the world. And I drop on these timelines about what was happening in different periods, and just try to imagine myself into that. So I just read whatever it took to imagine myself. And sometimes I had questions about something, so I'd go read about those, then come back, do some writing, and then another question would come. I was like, actually, I don't know what she would have done in that situation. I don't know actually how you get from there to there. What's the transport? So actually, London Transport Museum has got these amazing volunteers, and they know. They're like, the app on your phone. They're like that, but and they can say, like, I say, all right, I need to get from Blackfriars to the docks. How do I get from Blackfriars to the docks? And first of all, well, a young lady wouldn't go on a company to the docks. And I said, yes, but she needs to for this plot point. So just don't worry about that. How would you do it? In that case, you'd walk to this stop, and then she'd get the omnibus, and just, incredible, wonderful nerdy knowledge. And volunteers, so I counted so many generous people who were just really happy to sort of help me with my little obscure queries.
Isn't that wonderful? Yeah. I'm so heartened to hear that. It sounds like it was heaps of fun.